Maryland Videocast on April 6th. I keep saying the 5th, too. I got the time of day wrong. When we first tried this, I said, good morning, Dylan. It's actually the evening. Dylan Shelton, he is an organizer for Progressive Montgomery. He is very active in the fight for 15. We're going to discuss that with him and other issues as well. Dylan Shelton, good evening.
Good evening, Hal. How's it going today?
It's going well, and you disappeared from my screen for a second, but there you're back up, and I see the live, so that tells me things are working. You know, the technology is tremendous, except when it isn't.
Yeah, and there's that's something that I encounter every day too. It seems like as good as it gets, there's always those down periods exactly when you need it most. So good technology giveth, and a good technology taketh away.
It really is quite extraordinary. All right, so we're talking in different places, but we can see each other, and we are both active, as I mentioned, in Progressive Montgomery. That is a part of, I was going to say an offshoot. It's not an offshoot. It's part of Progressive Maryland, the website, progressivemaryland.org, right? Sometimes I say com. I think they both get to the same place, but it's .org, is it not, Dylan?
I believe it's .org. Yep, they're an organization, not a not the alternative, not the committee or anything like that. So yeah, .org is the right place to go to. It's the one I use.
progressivemaryland.org. I'm at the site right now. There's a lot of great stuff there. Our videos are there. If you go to progressivemaryland.org, you get the splash page where you sign up for the email updates. You go past that, and there's just so much good information, blogs, and of course, our video casts here. Usually I do these with Karen Guzman. She's great. She's off. Dylan is very graciously taking her place this evening. Dylan, let's start with what your focus is, your labor of love here in Montgomery County, that fight for the $15 minimum wage. First of all, tell us, why is this so important to all of us, and especially perhaps to you?
Yeah, so I guess I come from a place that does see economics as a sort of ground floor for getting all of the other social justice causes committed to, because I just see the economy as the one shared space that we all inhabit, no matter what, race, color, creed, ethnicity, gender, or anything that we may have. And it seems to me, and it seems to a lot of people who are a lot smarter than me, that the wages of the American workers have just not increased for many years, arguably since the mid-70s. And a $15 minimum wage would be the first step in a long series of battles to get the working people in America back to a place where they can provide for their families. And so in Progressive Montgomery, what we call this is family economic security. And I'm particularly working on the fight for 15. And some of our data has shown that no family in Montgomery County can live on the current minimum wage. The current minimum wage is just under $11. And for me, I came from a lower middle class family. When the recession started hitting, that just took even lower plunge. And, I really felt the economic bite, so to speak, and just felt like that's something that other kids shouldn't have to feel as well. And that's why when I moved to Maryland about a year and a half ago now, maybe 2 years, I got involved as quickly as I could with Progressive Maryland and the Progressive Montgomery chapter.
Do you think, Dylan, you're a young man, people who are watching this video can see, do you think folks from previous generations, baby boomers, who say, well, we had it tough, maybe they don't understand the assistance, even if they came from working class backgrounds, lower middle class backgrounds, that there really was a much tighter safety net back then. College was more affordable. Jobs did have better, blue collar jobs generally came with pensions, health care. So when people say, well, we were able to make it in the 60s and in the early 70s, they don't quite get how much tougher times are for working people today than they were 30, 40, 50 years ago. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that's caused by a multitude of things. One is, like you've said already, the shredding of the social safety net in the recent years, since the 80s on upwards, making it harder for families to get temporary assistance, the gutting of things like welfare under the Clinton era, the gutting of all types of social services under the Reagan era and the Bush era, taxes being cut for those getting the most in the society and being raised on those who make the least. And then as well, I'd add the labor unions have been declining steadily for years and years. And I think a lot of people have missed that it took a really long time and a lot of hard fights from the 20s and 30s and 40s 50s and 60s included, where labor unions were really pressing for a lot of things for working Americans that set the bar a little higher for those in labor unions and then those outside labor unions as well. So wages were rising, people were getting better employment opportunities, as well as standard defined pension benefits and et cetera, that were all through labor struggles that we really don't have as much these days. Not to say they're extinct, but the militancy and the decline of labor unions themselves and participation in them has been a real problem, I think, for the people of my generation, as well as, and my final addition would be the rise of things like task societies and the sharing economy, where things like Uber, the can go on the internet and do $5 a job tasks, has again contributed to a sort of hollowing out of standard and traditional areas of the economy that people could find work. And these are non-union Silicon Valley style jobs where collective bargaining is highly discouraged.
Do you think the decline of the Democratic Party, and I just want to harken back as I lead into this question to your comment about the importance of economics, that other social justice movements, the civil rights movement, the sexual revolution, the fight for gender equity and for rights for people who are outside the heteronormative in terms of sexuality. Do you think that these other fights may have stalled to a great degree, although we have seen gay rights, because the Democratic Party, which has traditionally been the champion, has neglected or has backed away from or no longer championing the economic rights of poor working class and middle class Americans?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of journalists who have actually commented a lot on this issue, where around the 70s and maybe the late 60s, the Democratic Party sort of shifted away from a more economically populist style campaign towards committing to primarily different social groups in a sort of shift from a working class base to the more Wall Street base, is how I would define it, from the Silicon Valley to the Wall Street donation or donor base.
Or from Main Street. I think people want to say from Main Street to Wall Street. So yeah, and the issues like keeping the minimum wage, maintaining it with inflation, adequately funding Social Security, kind of fell to the wayside, protecting labor unions. In fact, perhaps Democrats actually undermined those protections for working people. And do you think, and I guess, because there's been a lot of talk that whether Democrats should move away from group identity politics and move towards economic populism, I kind of see it, and I want your thoughts on this. They need to do both. But group identity politics isn't going to work without a focus on economic justice, because it's too easy to pit defined groups against each other, fighting for, a small amount, a few crumbs from the rich man's table, if you will.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree. I mean, this is a sort of Republican strategy to fracture certain voting bases as you pit them against things on wedge issues. And things like sexual orientation and race, it makes it very easy for them to come in and demonize the Democratic Party, because they're not talking about the economic factor as well. And I think the two are pretty much inseparable. I mean, we're actually in the midst of the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, and a big thing about his work was he not only was about the emancipation of the Black people, but also he died organizing the trash workers union, the garbage men in Tennessee, I believe. And so I think his work would have, if he was alive today, he would still be highly militant in both the emancipation of the minorities in the country, but also the economic rights of the country as well, and really championing what we might call social democratic values, because the two are really intertwined. I think we have to not only be a part and involved with the marginalized in the society, those who might fall under the Democratic Party's campaign of basing it around identity, but also those who are just within the country itself in terms of their economic status. The two are really intertwined really deeply with one another, I think.
You're watching the Progressive Maryland Videocast. I'm Hal Ginsberg. We've got the team leader for in the fight for 15 in Montgomery County, Progressive Montgomery's Dylan Shelton with us. And just a final comment on Dr. King, who I mentioned earlier today in another show I do. Dylan is maybe my favorite American. I think the greatest, one of the, on the short list, I guess you throw Abe Lincoln, FDR on that list. I'm not sure if there are too many others, but I think you hit on two critical aspects of his fight for justice, the civil rights fight and the fight for working Americans. Also, the fight for peace. I mean, he was outspoken when he was assassinated against the Vietnam War. And I think we miss his leadership certainly in that area as well. Dylan, we talked off air briefly before we began the recording here, the broadcast. And I was just wondering whether you think that there's adequate media coverage of Montgomery County. We don't have a daily newspaper. We don't have, I don't believe, any news radio station that's exclusive to or that focuses on our county. There's no TV stations that are based. They may have a studio here, but they're not based in this county. Do you think that the issues that are really important to us get enough media attention?
Absolutely not. I think this has been a growing problem since before even I was born. You look back at something like the Fairness Doctrine, and when that was taken out and the growing consolidation of basically corporate ownership of the media, there is no opposing views. You basically get hearsay on the national news media, and you get the buying up of small media companies on the local scale by these giant corporations. And when they stop becoming profitable, they simply shut them down. So there is no real local news coverage of Montgomery County that I've seen outside of maybe some of the internet's small blogs and people who are doing this as a labor of love. And that's a real problem because we don't hear the voices of those who are actually oppressed in the communities. There is no investigative reporting of what it's like to be a renter in Montgomery County and not have your landlord being properly attuned to what the needs are in the building or seeing the lives of people working for minimum wage in the county. And that really creates a sort of ignorance in the populace where they can't identify or show any type of solidarity with the people who have similar interests to their own. And it's been a real tragic flaw, I think, in the county. And things like what we're doing here are a way to remedy it. But without a real strong, vibrant media presence in the county that people see on an everyday basis, it's really having a pretty terrible effect, in my opinion.
I'm really worried about this, Dylan, and certainly what you and I are doing is, filling a very small part of that enormous void. You can go to progressivemaryland.org. As we mentioned before, you can read the many posts there. Some are by me. I don't know if you post there, Dylan, or not, but we have a lot of posts. We try to cover events. A lot of it, though, is opinion. It's punditry, less hard news reporting, although there is some. But we don't have those reporters that you can kind of look to as kind of I don't know if a gatekeeper is maybe, but just someone who's more objective, whose job is simply to tell you what happened, to give you the facts. Because if you read what I write, I mean, I think I'm incredibly credible, but I come to it from a certain perspective with a particular opinion, as do you, a very progressive one. And it's not a who, what, where, when, nor can it be by anybody comprehensive. We don't get all or even anywhere close to the important events that are covered here in the county. You mentioned labor of love. I like that expression. I heard that from another media ally today, Dylan. The idea is you just can't make money covering local stories. I know you're not in journalism. Do you think it's possible? You look at all these, the Twitters and all that and the YouTubes, and some people do blow up. You don't think like something that, really focuses on, we got 1 million people, they're rich in this county. I don't know. I think about it. I don't have an answer.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, some of that is just chance. Some of it is, sometimes there's not real substance behind the people who may blow up on, say, YouTube or Twitter. And I think that kind of the commodification of things like journalism has been a real problem. I mean, you look back at what arguably was the last period that had the similar economic circumstances as we had now. You had people like Upton Sinclair writing about all the millionaires and the conditions of workplaces. And there's really less of that now unless you really go digging for it. And I have to point out that you mentioned the Progressive Maryland blog. One of our volunteers with the Fight for 15, Steve Melkinsethian, has a great blog post up there where he just talks about what it's like to get involved in the Fight for 15 and his struggle standing up to people like Ike Leggett, and his experiences going to local events and debating with people like Sidney Katz the benefits of a minimum wage that's higher than what we currently have. That kind of stuff doesn't get shown a lot to people in the community. And if they had a real clear picture and real examples of people going out there and really challenging the powers that be, there may be a revitalized interest in these types of things. And people like Steve could really blow up and their experiences spread to a lot of different people. So I think it's possible, but it takes a lot of work too to get behind it and really do the work.
It is possible. It seems plausible, but we don't have those examples, at least that I'm aware of. As you mentioned, a lot of the people who blow up may not be the most talented. They may have a certain skill set, a certain appearance, a certain, I don't know, shtick, but they may not be providing the, objective or may not be credible news sources. With the loss of the local paper here, the Montgomery Journal, there was the Sentinel as well. Mm-hmm. Radio coverage, it puts more and more power in the hands of just the few media outlets that are still standing, like the Washington Post. And that's very problematic as well, because you mentioned the Fight for 15. The paper is owned by, a dedicated libertarian, somebody who's made billions, literally tens of billions of dollars from offshoring, from bringing in cheap stuff that's made overseas and selling it at the lowest possible price by paying by firing as many people as possible, hiring as few people as possible, and getting those few to work as hard as he possibly can for as little money. So This is not somebody who's clearly, sensitive to or sympathetic to labor. And a person like Steve, who you mentioned, isn't going to be welcomed with open arms to the Washington Post or to a TV station that's owned by a religious group like Sinclair that owns ABC, the ABC affiliate here in Washington, D.C. area.
Yeah, and I mean, when you mention the Washington Post, it's not just the policies like a $15 minimum wage. When it comes to candidates, I remember last year in the primary fight for District 3, my district here in Silver Spring, they endorsed Kathleen Matthews over Jamie Raskin, Kathleen Matthews has no electoral experience, and she was actually a staff member of a California Republican back in the 70s, and not a progressive Democrat or really even a strong centrist Democrat. They endorsed her over someone like Jamie Raskin, and Kathleen Matthews is our new Maryland state chair for the Democratic Party, or at least is the assumed to be chair of the Democratic Party. So they're definitely an establishment centerpiece, and people like their owner, Jeff Bezos, does all he can to really punch down labor and basically automate anything he can get his hands on.
Yeah, and they also did endorse the new Republican congresswoman in suburban Virginia, who is pretty hard right, although she claims to be more of a centrist. So really, this is not the paper does not reflect the pretty darn progressive views of most of the people who live in this region. Now I'm desperately scrambling. You know who I'm talking about? What's her name again? Do you know who I'm talking about? The congresswoman from Virginia?
The Virginia congresswoman I'm not aware of, no, but it doesn't surprise me that they would basically try to keep the status quo. And I think this is another reason why we have to have grassroots mobilization efforts, and we have to go knocking on doors, and we have to go in the city streets and tell people about what we're advocating for and what we think is the future of America, because the papers, under the current ownership status, they're simply not going to do it for us.
All right, I'm going to get you the name of that Republican congresswoman, and then,
Please.
but while I'm fighting to figure out what it is I'm frantically trying to type but not tap too loudly so it doesn't disturb everybody. We saw each other at an organization meeting for another group, even though both of us are active in Progressive Maryland, for Our Revolution, Montgomery County. What are the values, do you think, of groups such as Our Revolution working closely in terms of the goals, parallel with Progressive Maryland? And what about groups that are more, say, ad hoc, specific to one particular issue, such as I don't really want to say Black Lives Matter is a great example, but they do focus to a great degree on police violence. Obviously, the African American community's interests are extremely varied, just like the entire country, our interests. But when you take groups like that or the Sierra Club that seem to be focused on one issue groups, how do you see our group, Progressive Maryland, fitting in with these other organizations?
Yeah, so it's a little difficult to say. I mean, coalitions, when they work really well. We just mentioned, Martin Luther King brought the civil rights fight to the labor unions in Tennessee. As I think historically has been shown, when coalitions come together and fight for something they all believe in, things happen. The difficulty lies in a lot of the real politique, so to speak, behind a lot of these groups. The Sierra Club has got a very particular interest in preserving the environment, and rightfully so. But that may come at odds when a particularly labor-oriented group doesn't want to, say, divest from fracking concerns, for instance, or environmentally hazardous stocks that the county is invested in, simply to protect the pensions of their workers. So it's really tough to sort of iron out those differences. I think that creating a broad net, though, and as much as you can, and having those communication ties and relationships does make it easier to then later go to them and create an alliance. And I'd have to say, I mean, you mentioned Black Lives Matter. If you read their program on the Movement for Black Lives website, it's one of the most comprehensive and all-inclusive platforms that I've ever read. It goes from the economic down to the policing and pretty much every direction outside of that. And things like that, a broad base of values, concrete policies behind it that can be implemented. If you approach other groups with those and they can at least identify with some of those, you're going to get a sort of connection that will lead you to some successes in electoral and policy struggles that I think will benefit everyone. But it does really come down to the individual instances, I think. For instance, with our revolution, I think there's a lot that Progressive Maryland can really do to work with them and other groups in the area of Montgomery County. It's just going to be a little bit tough when it comes down to maybe particular policy issues, but I think you have to get there and decide on that type of thing when those confront them. So I'm fully in favor, though, of a broad net of coalitions to really strive for these particular policies and changes.
All right, you're watching the Progressive Maryland Videocast. My guest is Dylan Shelton. He's the team leader in the Fight for 15 as part of Progressive Montgomery, which is a subset, I guess, or it's a chapter. Maybe chapter is the right word.
Right. I think chapter is the best word, because we've got these spreading and popping up over all of Maryland, all under the heading of Progressive Maryland.
If you have if you're not too familiar with our group, please go to progressivemaryland.org. Check out all the different links there. You can watch this video there. You can watch this video at the Progressive Maryland YouTube page, which is also where we post it. And I haven't been good about putting it on SoundCloud, Dylan, because we've got a video and SoundCloud is just the audio. So like that.
Yeah. But as we were saying, to spread it and really to really blow up like some of these people have, I guess you have to spread it over every medium, and that seems to grow every day with the internet. But do our best to keep up.
No question. You want to be everywhere, but the SoundCloud, I think it's kind of dying. I don't know. What's your thought as I don't want to assume ages, but I'm just going to say, I think you're younger than I am. Is audio dying? Are we right now moving to an all video? I mean, the audio is part of the video, but just the flat old recording without seeing the person, is that kind of on the way out?
Well, you might be asking the wrong person. I mean, I'm a podcast junkie, really, so I'm always listening to something or an audio book of some kind on the metro going to and from work or just walking around. So I really like the audio format, and the video I can kind of take or leave. Then again, people have always told me I've got a face for radio, so maybe I'm just partial to audio.
I'm the one with the face for radio and the voice for TV. So leave your, don't start going after yourself. I love radio. I mean, I was raised on the radio. I think there's a song, but that was back in the 60s and 70s. And I think we had better music. The best music was whatever was on the radio when you were 17. But now nobody listens to radio. So even then, when people say they listen to radio, they really mean they listen to radio station streams that are on
Hmm.
the internet. Is pretty much
Yeah,
what it
it's
means.
really changing. So SoundCloud, that could be the next one to go, really, as a lot of these mechanisms sort of transfer to other places. But I've seen a surprising amount of people use it because of its apparently very easy to host on, and it's, I believe, free to do so. And it's a place where people can kind of let the creative juices flow, I guess, and things like our own broadcast can be hosted without having to have that significant capital backing like you would have at a regular commercial radio station. So I see it as a viable alternative, at least, to get dissident voices or just alternative voices out there to people.
Well, now you're making me realize I've got to post this at SoundCloud as well. It's just one more thing I got to put together. But what the heck, we'll get that all done. It is, by the way, April 6th. I got to change the title of this video too. It's April. I have it as April 5th, but it's actually April 6th, 7:05. We got a few more minutes with Dylan Shelton. He is the team leader in the Fight for 15 Progressive Montgomery. I'm Hal Ginsberg, your host of this Progressive Maryland Videocast. My co-host, my regular co-host, Karen Guzman. Fear not, loyal viewers and listeners. Karen will be back shortly. She's been very, very busy at work, and she just simply was not available. So we scared Dylan up, and we're very, very glad he did. We did. I did. Yes, very happy I did. By the way, the not progressive, the Republican from Virginia, her name is Barbara Comstock. You probably saw her
Oh,
ads.
yeah, I do recall this now. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I know of her now. Yeah, I remember her. Her name definitely rings out. So I didn't know that the Post had endorsed her, but I'm sad to hear that news. I guess I'm not necessarily surprised.
They endorsed her in the general election, in just a few months ago. And the name Comstock because my son William is a big history buff, and especially the 19th century and the gold rush. So we were talking about the Comstock lode, and that led to Barbara Comstock. So
oh, no kidding.
was trying to remember her name. I just couldn't figure it out. It was driving me crazy, so I had to keep going and wouldn't pop up. All right, some good news, Dylan. We try to provide some news here. This is pretty breaking. You were not aware of this. I broke it to you, and it came to me in my email. Yes, email does really tell us a lot. In the Washington Post update this evening. By the way, did you see a tornado? Because there was really strong wind.
I heard reports of it, and I was in D.C. when that big rain hit. I did not see the tornado, though, so I missed out on that event.
Well, maybe no one saw the tornado. We're not certain there was one. The Post says there could have been a micro tornado right around Union Station because the damage that was done bespeaks very, very powerful winds that are close to, if not at tornado-like speed. But it was in a very small, contained area, fortunately, and we're not certain because the pictures they got just aren't good enough to determine if there really was that the whirlpool effect that you get with the tornado. So here's the breaking news, not the tornado. The breaking news is Maryland becomes first state to reimburse Planned Parenthood clinics if Congress cuts funding, and that was over the veto of our Republican. The Democrats stood up. Dylan, we got to pat them on the back.
Yeah, when it does happen, as surprising as it may be, I mean, this is a significant thing, and this is worth congratulating because, women's health. It's a lot of people have the misconception about Planned Parenthood, and it's really about providing women with the health care that they need. So, I'm really happy to hear that news. I was incredibly excited to hear it from you when you told me just before we started recording. That's great news.
It really is. It's so important what Planned Parenthood does and all the services they provide. They get a lot of negative attention from anti-choice people because they do provide essential services, essential abortion services, but it's a very small part of their work.
Right.
And so, I'm really glad.
It's a really good sign that Maryland, despite having the governor we do have, I mean, we're gonna stand up for people when their health care is in trouble, and I hope to see that something like this happens if something should happen to the Affordable Care Act, if the Republicans federally can get their game together and actually pass what they've been saying they're going to pass for the last 7 or so years. God forbid something happens to the Affordable Care Act, we can hopefully pressure to keep some type of health care in place, some infrastructure in place here in Maryland that provides for the people who are covered under that as well, because that's really where we've got to be looking ahead to, I think. I
agree, and I think there's a critical mass of people in this state. I think we're close to. 6 million is the number that pops into my head. It may even be more. That's
Yeah,
enough. That's enough. And we're a wealthy state, one of the wealthiest.
right,
We can certainly afford, and we should afford, to guarantee every Marylander, comprehensive care. And
right.
I would add, it would not only can we afford it, I would say we can't afford not to. It's more
Oh,
expensive
absolutely.
not to have this type of service.
Yeah,
This right, that by not affording this right, we cost us all more money.
yeah, absolutely. I think there's no doubt about that.
Dylan, we've got just about a minute or two left. I just wanted to talk about one more story. This is national. We do try to focus on Maryland with the Progressive Maryland Videocast, as you can imagine, with Dylan, who's a Montgomery County activist, as I am from Montgomery County. We're talking more about our particular county. With Karen, we talk about PG County a lot too, because that's where she's from. But the national story, the filibuster was kicked out. I mean, it was the nuclear option was invoked. I wasn't absolutely certain Republicans would have the 50 votes necessary to do this. They did. Um, I'm pretty upset. Your thoughts?
Um, yeah, I mean, it is upsetting. I never want to hear the words about John McCain being some maverick ever again, because he went right along with this. I think anytime, the Republican leash is pulled by their big money donors, they fall right in line. So no more of this, oh, he's, a conservative Republican. I think they're all in that same sinking ship now. It's interesting though, I guess. The filibuster does sort of, it provides for small rural Republican states to sort of take control and steer some of the agenda sometimes. So have the ability to do that anymore, at least for Supreme Court decisions. If I'm understanding the nuclear option right, it still holds up for some of the other presidential appointments.
For legislation. For legislation.
Yeah, and for legislation. That said, though, we're now going to quite possibly, and I think quite likely, have Gorsuch on the Supreme Court now, which basically means, at least 30 years or so of reactionary rule on the Supreme Court. And one in the first place, I think this is just a tragedy. And, it was at least somewhat inspiring to see someone like Jeff Merkley get up and do a 15-hour stall, or at least show of force, a few days ago. But, I'm not sure what we do from here besides just continue to put up a fight and try to make sure that whatever we do, we stand tall against any other Republican encroachments, because this is going to be a court that now is going to, come pretty much close to siding with corporations in every case that comes before them now.
Well,
So
certainly
it's a real
Gorsuch
tragedy.
did. Gorsuch is, absurdly, and the frozen trucker case is especially upsetting, where the trucker had to leave to survive. He was freezing to death, and frigid, below zero temperatures for hours, directed to stay there. And when he drove off, he was fired. And Gorsuch, in the minority, said that was a legitimate termination. Quite extraordinary, really. And he is on the court. He will be, almost certainly. It is very upsetting. The senators who voted no and voted to filibuster actually represent more Americans in total than the senators who voted in favor. So that goes to your point that the small states are in control.
Yeah, and the Senate has always been a sort of, it's almost undemocratic how it functions, because it gives so much weight to these small sort of reactionary patches of the American public. But it's going to be, unfortunately, our future now. And I think anybody who, lover or hater, who didn't vote for Hillary Clinton didn't have in mind this the stolen court seat. If they chose to stay out of the race, this is a really tragic result that comes out of that now, for people choosing basically their personal animus against someone rather than voting with, what the future of the country needed. Unfortunately, we're now in the position where we have another person like Scalia on the courts now. So it's real tragedy.
Well, no question, she was the least bad alternative, who was certainly viable, who could have gotten on the court. You mentioned what Democrats need to do. Certainly keep up the fight. And we'll just finish off with this thought. Again, I think what you said, and maybe we're just going back to the beginning, they've got to fight for economic justice. They got to fight for working people every step of the way. What I find very disappointing is I haven't heard word one from Democrats about supporting Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill. I think they should unite behind that. This should be the Democratic brand should be, we're going to provide, just as we were talking about for Maryland, health care for all Americans. And also the bill by Tulsi Gabbard in the Congress to legalize marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Black Lives Matter. They very rightly so are focused like laser beams on that particular, on the war, the so-called war on drugs, which has resulted in, as you mentioned, an unprecedented number of people of color locked up and huge profits for the prison industry. This is something Democrats need to stand together against. And if they did, I think they'd have much more success than they had in recent years in elections.
Yeah, I think they should take a hard look at who they are actually supporting. Things like the decriminalization of marijuana is something to stop this massive prison industrial complex that we have. And I mean, if on the point of Medicare for all, there's actually an interesting piece out on Vox. I'm failing to remember the author right now, but if you look up Vox Trump focus group, I believe you can probably find it using those keywords. There's a very interesting focus group that one of their reporters held with Trump supporters that showed that all of these people were in favor of having single-payer healthcare. And when you combine that with the majority of Americans who are polled by places like Pew saying that they want single-payer healthcare or something like Medicare for all, I think the evidence is overwhelming that the Democrats, if they were to take up a battle like that, they would be swept into office in 2018 and 2020. So it's mind-boggling why they won't do something like that or getting behind something like legalization. But we've got to keep pressuring them from the bottom to the top of the pyramid and showing them that we'll vote them out of office. We'll do whatever we have to get them to go further to the left on these issues.
All right, we're going to let that be the final word from Dylan Shelton, my special guest on the Progressive Maryland podcast. It'll be at progressivemaryland.org shortly. If you're watching it, it's obviously there or on YouTube.
Thank you very much.
Maryland page. Hey, thank you so much, Dylan. Great talking to you. I hope we can do this again soon.
Anytime, yeah.
Well, there you go. We'll do it again soon. And I'll be back hopefully with Karen in, I don't know, just within a week or so. Thanks so much for watching. Stay tuned for many more of these videocasts.